Under the grey autumn sky of Beijing, tension and rhetoric filled the air as China's foreign ministry convened its regular press briefing, but this one carried unusual weight. Just hours earlier, US President Donald Trump had unveiled a sweeping new tariff package targeting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese exports. It was the latest in a long-running tug-of-war between the world's two largest economies and the first direct challenge to China since Trump's return to the White House. In the marble halls of the ministry, cameras clicked as reporters gathered. Then, stepping calmly to the podium, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian faced the press. His posture was confident, his words carefully chosen, his tone firm. He was not only addressing journalists, he was sending a message to Washington. Lin began by acknowledging the question everyone was waiting for: China's official response to President Trump's tariff threat. His remarks, measured but unmistakably sharp, underscored the frustration and defiance that have come to define Beijing's stance toward US trade policy. He declared that the United States had continued to impose a series of restrictive and sanctioning measures on China, seriously harming China's interests. He emphasized that China firmly opposes this and accused Washington of threatening high tariffs instead of reflecting on its own mistakes. This, Lin said, is not the right way to engage with China. The tone was diplomatic, but the meaning was unmistakable. Beijing had no intention of backing down. The backdrop to this exchange is months of rising tension. Trump's economic team had been telegraphing the move for weeks, arguing that China's trade practices and subsidies were unfair, that American industries were being undermined by cheap imports, and that it was time, as the president put it, to level the playing field. But to Chinese officials, these were old accusations wrapped in new rhetoric, a replay of the trade battles of Trump's first term. Only this time, the stakes are higher, the economy's more entangled, and the political consequences more severe. Lin Jian continued, urging Washington to correct its erroneous practices and resolve mutual concerns through dialogue on the basis of equality, respect, and mutual benefit. He referenced the important consensus reached in the call between the two presidents, referring to the brief phone conversation between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump earlier this month. A call meant to cool tensions, but that clearly failed to stop escalation. Lin warned that if the United States insists on its own way, China will resolutely take corresponding measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. This was Beijing's classic two-track approach, the offer of dialogue paired with the threat of retaliation. In diplomatic language, it was both a warning and an invitation, signaling that China prefers negotiation but will not yield under pressure. Across the Pacific, markets were already reacting. The Shanghai Composite Index dropped sharply. The yuan weakened against the dollar. Investors sensed that a new phase of the U.S. China trade war had begun. Economists warned that a prolonged standoff could slow global growth, disrupt supply chains, and deepen inflationary pressures worldwide. For China, though, this is not just about economics. It's about sovereignty and dignity. The message from the ministry was clear. China will not be dictated to. It will engage, but only as an equal. Then Lin Jian shifted focus from tariffs to technology. A reporter asked about the recent decision by the Dutch government involving Nexperia, a Chinese-owned semiconductor company. The Netherlands had approved a partial takeover of Nexperia by a domestic consortium, effectively limiting Chinese control. Lin's answer was pointed. He reminded the room that China consistently opposes generalizing the concept of national security and warned against discriminatory practices against firms from specific countries. He said all nations should adhere to market principles and refrain from politicizing economic and trade issues. In plain terms, Lin was accusing Western governments of using national security as an excuse to shut Chinese companies out of key sectors, from chips to telecommunications. He ended that part of his response with a phrase that has become routine in Chinese diplomacy, but no less forceful. China's determination to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests is unwavering. I would like to emphasize that the United States has recently continued to impose a series of restrictive and sanctioning measures on China, which have seriously harmed China's interests. China firmly opposes this. Instead of reflecting on its own mistakes, the United States has instead threatened high tariffs. This is not the right way to engage with China. Behind those words lies a growing realization in Beijing that the global technology landscape is being redrawn, with China's access to semiconductors, AI systems, and rare earth materials now subject to increasing restrictions. The Nexperia case is not isolated. It's part of a wider campaign by the United States and its allies to contain China's technological rise. In Beijing's view, this is economic containment disguised as security. In Washington's view, it's protection against espionage and dependency. As Lin spoke, it was clear that the ministry was not just defending one company, it was defending an entire national strategy. Technology, after all, is the backbone of China's ambition to become a global power. And in this geopolitical chess game, every chip factory, every trade license, every investment decision counts. Then the tone of the briefing shifted again. A foreign journalist asked about reports of a crackdown on underground churches in several Chinese provinces. It was a sensitive question, one that touches the nerve of China's domestic policy and international image. Lin Jian's response was curt, almost rehearsed. "I'm not familiar with the situation you mentioned," he began, before emphasizing that the Chinese government manages religious affairs in accordance with the law and protects citizens' freedom of religious belief. But then he pivoted to a warning. "We firmly oppose the United States interfering in China's internal affairs under the pretext of so-called religious issues." It was the same formulaic pattern China often uses in such briefings. Deny the accusation, assert legal management, then accuse Washington of hypocrisy and interference. But behind the words lies a broader point that for Beijing, domestic control and political stability remain paramount. Whether the issue is trade, technology, or religion, China's message is consistent. Foreign criticism will not change domestic policy. As the briefing continued, the broader themes of China's diplomacy emerged clearly. Defiance mixed with calls for calm, confrontation wrapped in appeals for dialogue. Lin Jian's composure throughout was notable. He neither raised his voice nor softened his tone. His role was to project steadiness, to assure both domestic and foreign audiences that China was prepared for whatever came next. By late afternoon, news agencies around the world were carrying Lin's remarks. In Washington, US officials dismissed the comments as predictable. In Brussels, the European Commission said it was monitoring the situation closely. In Tokyo and Seoul, analysts worried about supply chain disruptions and the knock-on effects of escalating trade barriers. Chinese state media, meanwhile, framed the story very differently. Editorials in the Global Times and CCTV accused Washington of economic bullying and warned that Trump's actions could backfire on American consumers. The language was fierce but familiar, part of the government's narrative that portrays China as a victim of unjust Western aggression. Economically, the costs are mounting on both sides. In the US, importers face higher prices and disrupted logistics. In China, export industries that depend on US markets are feeling the strain, but both governments appear determined to stand firm, each appealing to domestic audiences that prize strength over compromise. Still, in the midst of this clash, there remains a thin thread of communication. Lin Jian's repeated references to the call between the two presidents suggest that diplomatic lines remain open, even if fragile. For now, the two sides seem to be testing each other's resolve rather than seeking real compromise. Beyond trade, the stakes extend far into global geopolitics. The semiconductor struggle, symbolized by Nexperia, represents the next great frontier of competition. Technology, once seen as a neutral tool of progress, is now a weapon of influence. Whoever controls the chips controls the future, and that future is no longer shared, it's contested. China urges the United States to correct its erroneous practices as soon as possible and, guided by the important consensus reached in the call between the two presidents, resolve mutual concerns through dialogue on the basis of equality, respect and mutual benefit, properly manage differences and maintain the stable, healthy and sustainable development of China-US relations. If the United States insists on its own way, China will resolutely take corresponding measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. Within China, Lin Jian's performance at the press conference was praised as calm and authoritative. On Weibo, hashtags like #China will not yield and #Defend our interests trended for hours. Many citizens expressed anger at the US tariffs, urging the government to retaliate. Others voiced anxiety that this trade battle could lead to job losses or price hikes. But official messaging remained resolute. China's economy is resilient, its leadership confident, its path unchanged. State commentators reminded viewers that China's domestic consumption now accounts for over 60% of GDP, making it less vulnerable to foreign shocks. Still, the underlying tension is impossible to ignore. The trade dispute has become more than an argument about numbers or tariffs. It has become a struggle over identity and dominance, a question of who sets the terms of global trade and technology in the 21st century. As the minutes of the briefing passed, the symbolism of the scene deepened. Lin Jian, standing beneath the national emblem, represented more than just a government spokesman. He embodied Beijing's posture toward a world that it believes is trying to contain it. His composure was a message in itself. China will not be provoked into outrage. It will respond strategically, not emotionally. By the end of the briefing, Lin had answered questions about 3 separate subjects: tariffs, technology, and religion. Yet all 3 pointed to one central theme: resistance to external pressure. Whether that pressure comes through economic sanctions, corporate restrictions, or moral critique, Beijing's answer remains the same. China will handle its affairs by its own rules. After more than an hour, Lin Jian closed his folder, gave a brief nod to the audience, and stepped down from the podium. The press room filled with the rustle of papers and the low hum of reporters filing their stories. Outside, the sun was setting over Beijing's Chang'an Avenue, a city that has seen countless diplomatic storms but continues to stand firm through each one. For the world watching, the question now is simple but profound. How far will this confrontation go? Will it end as before in a fragile truce, or will it escalate into a full-blown economic Cold War? So far, both sides seem locked into their positions. Trump's administration insists that tariffs are long overdue and necessary to restore fairness. Beijing counters that dialogue, not coercion, is the only path forward. Between those 2 visions lies a widening gulf, one that threatens to reshape global trade for years to come. As the markets close and headlines ripple across continents, one image remains vivid: Lin Jian, standing before a wall of microphones, his voice calm but resolute, declaring that China will take corresponding measures if pushed too far. It is a diplomatic performance repeated many times before, but in 2025, with technology wars, religious debates, and tariffs converging, its resonance is greater than ever. In the end, this was not just a press conference. It was a declaration of intent that China, facing both pressure and provocation, will chart its own course. And as both Washington and Beijing brace for the next move, the world watches, wondering whether this rivalry can ever be truly managed or whether it is destined to define an entire generation. The cameras fade, the journalists disperse, but the message lingers. China will talk, but it will not bend. And in that unwavering stance lies the essence of a geopolitical era, one where dialogue is diplomacy, and every word, every tariff, and every press conference becomes another move in the long game between 2 superpowers shaping the world's future.
下一个问题。
访华的消息，中方如何看待当前的中西关系？对此访有
赴瑞士举行中瑞第4轮外长级战略对话。发言人能否介绍？
广电记者提问。据报道，近日巴基斯坦与阿富汗在方对此有何评论？谢谢。
我要强调。
I would like to emphasize that the United States has recently continued to impose a series of restrictive and sanctioning measures on China, which have seriously harmed China's interests. China firmly opposes this. Instead of reflecting on its own mistakes, the United States has instead threatened high tariffs. This is not the right way to engage with China. China urges the United States to correct its erroneous practices as soon as possible and, guided by the important consensus reached in the call between the 2 presidents, resolve mutual concerns through dialogue on the basis of equality, respect and mutual benefit, properly manage differences and maintain the stable, healthy and sustainable development of China-US relations. If the United States insists on its own way, China will resolutely take corresponding measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. I would like to point out that China consistently opposes generalizing the concept of national security and discriminatory practices against firms from specific countries. Relevant countries should earnestly adhere to market principles and refrain from politicizing economic and trade issues. China's determination to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests is unwavering. I'm not familiar with the situation you mentioned. The Chinese government manages religious affairs in accordance with the law and protects citizens' freedom of religious belief and normal religious activities. We firmly oppose the United States interfering in China's internal affairs under the pretext of so-called religious issues.